So, French President Emmanuel Macron has openly considered the idea of sending European forces to assist Ukraine in the conflict against Russia, hinting at a significant escalation of the war. However, the prospect of Western democracies deploying ground forces in Ukraine remains pretty unlikely. Following a pro Ukraine summit, Macron's statement drew a stern reaction from Russia, obviously, but also led European leaders to clarify their positions as well. A NATO representative confirmed that the alliance does not intend to send combat forces into Ukraine. At the Paris summit, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz mentioned that although there was a robust discussion, the consensus among attendees was against sending troops. Macron emphasized that the option of military deployment was discussed but not agreed upon among the 22 leaders that were present at this summit. He underscored the commitment to prevent Russian victory in the conflict, though. Despite Macron's openness, several European officials, including strong supporters of Ukraine like the UK, Poland, Spain, and Italy, opposed the deployment plan. Scholz reiterated that the collective decision against sending ground troops from European or NATO countries to Ukraine remains. However, Macron announced the formation of a new coalition to provide Ukraine with medium and long-range missiles for the long term. Now, with American aid for Ukraine being delayed by congressional disagreements, Europe faces increased pressure to support Ukraine against Russian advances. The European Union has committed over $150 billion in aid, but the deployment of troops would represent a significant shift from earlier stances at the onset of the invasion. Now, despite Macron's efforts, the immediate necessity is really to just rearm Ukraine at this point. And it's much more of a pragmatic approach to focus on that than to talk about any kind of theoretical troop movements from NATO. Now, the concept of strategic autonomy remains a long-term goal, but the current focus for Ukraine is on addressing the immediate needs to stop the Russians from moving, as they are making advances as we speak. Now, in France, Macron's statements have sparked some debate. There are some opposition lawmakers labeling them as potentially aggressive, while the defense minister has defended the stance as somewhat pragmatic, something that maybe it's a realistic situation to keep Russia from taking Ukraine and then moving on afterwards. Now, the U.S. has reiterated its position, and that is we're not sending American troops to Ukraine, which aligns with the NATO stance. So my take on this is NATO won't be sending troops due, frankly, to the legalities within the treaty. Ukraine is not a NATO member. I wish they were, but they are not. So any action taken by NATO against Russia would technically be considered an offensive action. The very nature of the treaty is defensive for member nations. Therefore, offensive action would undermine the rules-based order that the U.S. and the West rightfully tout as the proper and civil way to govern global affairs. What about Kosovo, you may ask, where no NATO member was attacked, but NATO deployed troops? Well, NATO is actually one of the security arms of the UN that can be used. Now, it's not always used, and it's not necessarily that they are tied together, but the UN has a framework to use NATO forces as necessary. And the UN Security Council resolution that created the military technical agreement between NATO and the UN to fulfill peacekeeping mandates in Kosovo is one of those situations. No such mandate exists for Ukraine because obviously Russia vetoes any kind of attempt to create a peacekeeping force moving into Ukraine. And because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, it'll never happen. Now, the UN doesn't have a military, so it uses peacekeeping mandates with specific countries and even NATO to execute the security arm of the UN. This is allowed under both the UN and NATO. So why would Macron say this? Well, Macron is trying to reinforce France's leadership within Europe, especially as the continent faces potential threats from Russia and uncertainties regarding the US's commitment under a possible second Trump administration. This is something France has been discussing for years, finding a way for Europeans to not rely as heavily on the US for its collective defense. This goes back to 2018 when Macron even discussed a European Union army and was scoffed at. With Britain taking a step back in European affairs after Brexit, France is positioning itself as the leader on the continent. This jives with the fact that economically and militarily, France is in one of the best positions to lead Europe heading into the future. I believe they're actually in a better position than Germany. Macron has also indicated a shift from his previous stance on purchasing non-European Union arms for Ukraine. Previously, he didn't like going outside of the European Union, but there's now an urgent need, and he understands this because he sees that Europe's arsenals are depleting. What's likely to happen is these additional arms are going to come from places like Asian countries or the United States. So he's taking a hardline stance here to try and rally Europe to bolster its defenses internally within NATO, to try to potentially get ahead of any possible conflict that could happen with Russia. And he wants to do this with France as the European lead. Will it work? Will other countries go along? Will the US kind of take a back seat as the preeminent NATO force, even in Europe? Not sure, only time will tell.